Hello YouTube. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite things, which is isolation movements. And I'm here to debunk an idea that is being thrown around. And the idea is that because you cannot truly fully isolate a muscle, therefore any type of isolation movements is bad. And you should just do compound movements because you get more out of less efforts in a sense because you're going to work all your muscles at once. First off, let me start by saying that most advocates of that methods should really pay attention to the way their body looks, and that would give them a good indication of why isolation movements are so important. Because a lot of these guys have glaring imbalances, they have muscle and body parts that are not developed at all, which tends to happen when you refuse to isolate a muscle. And of course, pure isolation is not really something that is possible. For example, you would be hard pressed to find a curl variation that only isolates the bicep. You're going to have some forearm activation in there, you're going to have some shoulder activation in there. But it doesn't make the movement useless. It just means that it's a movement that is going to prioritize the bicep, recruit the bicep, and have some muscles help with the movement. In a sense, what we call isolation movements are really compound movements. More or less, because there are less joints involved, and usually when we say compound movements, it means there are multiple joints involved. But if we're just speaking about multiple muscle groups being fired at once, then isolation movements are a less diverse, or rather a more precise and focused version of compound movements. And this is where they come into play when you try to really work on certain aspects of the physique. I spoke against just doing compound movements in the past, and the main reason why I think they're not the best to build a physique when it comes to details is because you're basically shooting too wild. You're using a shotgun instead of a sniper. You are going to work a lot of muscles, yes, but to what extent each muscle is worked is not really known. And I'm going to make another video developing that very thought. For now, I just want to really work on that idea that isolation movements should be discarded because there is no such thing as isolation. Another thing you can hear also is people who say that isolating certain parts of the muscle is also not possible. You will hear that with biceps, you will hear that with calves, you will hear that with forearms. People who tell you that basically you either work the entirety of the muscle or you don't. There's no such thing as one part of the muscle that gets worked more. And again, I disagree with that idea. Yes, there is no way to just activate the short head of the bicep, but you can play with your grip, you can play with the angle to have more activation of the short head and less activation of the long head, which is going to put the accent on the short head. The funny thing too with these people is that they tend to use science to prove that they're right. Well, they'll show you data that with numbers that show that during X exercise, those two muscle groups got activated almost as much, and they'll use numbers that are very close to one another. And for me, the only thing it proves is that the difference between the two numbers is more important than people think. Because I've seen certain studies that show the difference, for example, in muscle activation between a sumo deadlift and a conventional deadlift, and the numbers were not that different. And a lot of people started thinking, oh, it must mean that it's because it works the same muscles. The first thing that came into my mind is, no, it just means that those numbers are not representative, meaning that they are not creating enough of a gap for people to realize how different the lifts are. Because for me, there is a striking difference between the muscles that are going to be activated on the sumo and the deadlift conventional. And if you use one of those two exercises, primarily as a muscle builder, you're going to see a difference between only doing sumo and only doing conventional. And that ties up to what isolation movements are good for. When you do a compound it is tough to isolate, or rather to put all of your energy on one muscle, because so many of them are involved at once, that sometimes it just comes down to form, or it comes down to which muscle is dominant. And that muscle is going to take over, and it's going to also drain all of the growth from the exercise. With isolation, you can really focus on that movement. Also, because isolation movements tend to be less taxing, they're less stressful because you move less weight, and therefore you don't have to go as fast. You can really focus on the movement and where the movement should go and what it should be doing to your muscles. So that's, for me, wrapping up the issue. I think a lot of people who don't like isolation are people who are in love with compound movements, and they've decided that it's all they needed. Even if the picture in the mirror is not showing that, they still stick to that because it has become their religion. And that is something that I'm going to preach against on this channel. Do not let your training regimen become your religion. Do not idolize lifts. Use them to get results. If they don't provide results, dump them and replace them by something better. And for me, anyone who is running an hypertrophy program with no isolation movements is making a big mistake. In my opinion, they are key and very important. And just because the muscles they work are not as big, or they represent show muscles, which is a term I'll be discussing because it's key for bodybuilding, doesn't mean you should discard them. Because if you do, you're going to be one of those people that are going to potentially get very strong. But if you want to transition to physique and aesthetic eventually, you're going to have to catch up so much because you basically neglected certain muscles for so long that it's going to be a uphill battle that might make you so discouraged that you're going to go straight back to the mentality of only doing compounds, which, if what you want is having a good looking body, is not efficient enough. So that's that for that mentality of isolation movements are useless. Let me know in the comments what you think, and have a good day.